Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We know people are still rolling in, but we are about to get started. So if you could find your seats rather quickly, and look at that. Good morning, everyone. That was I heard this side of the room. Good morning, everyone. All right, now it's a No, we're going to stop there. Well, I'm so excited, super honored to be here, honored to welcome you to the 2022 Diversity Forum hosted by the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement. Now in its 22nd year, this year's Diversity Forum theme, The Power of Remembering, Reclaiming Our Legacies to Imagine New Futures, calls for us to take a deeper look into the histories that have shaped our institutions, ourselves, our cities, our states, and this nation. I hope and trust that you have come ready to learn and engage with others, and that you will leave the forum energized and ready to help create, promote, and sustain equitable and inclusive working and learning environments characterized by a genuine sense of accountability, responsibility, action, and commitment. I would like to take this time to recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. We would like to honor the Ho-Chunk people along with the other 11 First Nations within the state of Wisconsin. We acknowledge their sovereignty as First Nations and the national celebration of Native American Heritage Month. Please take a moment to remember the many legacies of displacement, migration, violence, and settlement that brings us here today. I would also like to take this time to acknowledge all military veterans of the United States Armed Forces. Our nation celebrated Veterans Day this past Friday, November 11th. It was a day to honor those who put their lives on the line so that we can be ensured the freedoms we currently enjoy. You all swore a solemn oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and your service is indeed appreciated. Thank you for fighting for America's freedom, and thank you for your continued efforts and sacrifices to maintain that freedom. Last year, I began my tenure as UW-Madison's Chief Diversity Officer. During my initial listening tour, I engaged with over 3,500 university constituents, gathering data that informed DDEA's 4 strategic priorities for the next 2 years, which in short involves creating and maintaining a culture of organizational learning, establishing and maintaining a culture of belonging, enabling a distributed model of strategic diversity leadership, and utilizing data to maximize and inform equity-minded policies, practices, programs, and curriculum. These priorities will lead us into the conclusion of our current Real Change Diversity Plan and into the next iteration of UW's Strategic Diversity Planning, which is set to begin in 2024. With Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin now at the helm, we are excited about the opportunity to reflect on our progress with her and strategize about the best path forward. As an organization, UW-Madison has been on an equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging journey. And this year's Diversity Forum will feature several opportunities to explore both who we have been and who we want to become. It is my hope that you will have an opportunity to visit the Public History Project's exhibition entitled Sifting and Reckoning, UW-Madison's History of Exclusion and Resistance. This exhibit gives voice to those who were silenced in the past, empowering us to confront the future with a more complete and honest understanding of where we come from as an institution and as a community. The Sifting and Reckoning exhibit will be available both in person and virtually, so please do not miss it. It is my hope that for the next 2 days, you will learn in community with one another, build collaborations, and leave with innovative strategies to make your living, learning, and working in communities all that we know they can be. I dare you to think about familiar concepts in new ways that add value to the whole. When the forum concludes, I challenge you to continue the learning with this year's Go Big read, How the Word is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America by Clint Smith. Smith's work is an examination of the stories hidden in plain view and a reflection on how encountering the past can serve to create new vision for the future, which aligns perfectly with this year's theme. As we learn together, let us use this knowledge to inform our culture of belonging efforts and make certain that equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, social justice, racial justice principles are interwoven into the fabric of our policies, our practices, our programs, and our curriculum. I truly believe in the power of change and all the possibilities that go along with it. This work is difficult, but not impossible. I'm reminded that an impossibility is only a possibility that we do not yet understand. Now, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day. Since the 1970s, American Indian students have nurtured our community here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now, 50 years later, we celebrate their stories of education and activism. Here to present the American Indian Studies at 50, Looking Back and Moving Forward project is Dr. Kasey Keeler. Dr. Keeler is an assistant professor of American Indian Studies and Civil Society and Community Studies at UW-Madison. She is an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne and Miwok Indians and is a direct descendant of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her scholarship examines American Indian peoples' access to land, mainly through the lens of suburbanization and property, while disrupting narratives of settler colonialism and challenging American Indian erasure. Dr. Keeler's first book, American Indians and the American Dream, Policies, Place, and Property in Minnesota, will be published by the University of Minnesota Press in early 2023. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keeler to the stage.
Good morning. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I am an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne Band of Miwoks, a small tribe in present-day East Central California, located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. I am also a direct descendant of the citizen band of Potawatomi. As a Native woman, I remain a visitor to this land, Dejop, something I often reflect on. As such, it is my responsibility to be a good steward and relative and to share the ways I acknowledge my presence here and the work that must be done by a land acknowledgement, beyond the recitation of words that have become commonplace. The Ho-Chunk have long called this region Dejop home. In 1832, a treaty signed between the Ho-Chunk Nation and the federal government forced the tribal nation to cede their territory, to make way for white settlement and eventual Wisconsin statehood. In the decades to come, the federal government would wage armed assaults on the Ho-Chunk, forcing them beyond the borders of what became Wisconsin territory and eventually the state of Wisconsin. Colonial violence would not end with the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk. In the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, whose iconic statue sits atop Bascom Hill, signed the Morrill Act in 1862. This piece of legislation created the land-grant university system. In Wisconsin, the Treaty of 1837 alone allowed for over 1 million acres of indigenous land to be funneled into the land-grant system of 33 separate universities across the United States, more than any other single land cession or land grab, as they have come to be referred to by Native community members today. The University of Wisconsin acquired over 235,000 acres of indigenous land to add to their endowment, a 24-to-1 return on investment. Today, while the University of Wisconsin continues the important reparative work that must be done to build responsible and respectful relationships with the 12 tribal nations of Wisconsin, we must take seriously the issues of access to the University of Wisconsin American Indian students face as a direct result of these historical legacies and the responsibility and obligation of the university. I share this history and reality today to move beyond a land acknowledgement statement, which again is often mere words on a paper. Instead, throughout Native November and every day, I encourage you to sit with this discomfort that these facts may provoke, but more importantly, to make change and to take action. To know this history, to tell this history, to educate yourselves on dispossession and decolonization, and to demand change. One way myself and colleagues from the American Indian Studies program with allies from the University of Wisconsin Archives and the University of Wisconsin's Public History Project, including Kasey Lucchini-Butcher, who you will be hearing from shortly, we have worked collectively to make American Indian histories and experiences on campus visible and to elevate the significance of Native American and Indigenous studies as a scholarly field. One way we have done this is through the American Indian Studies 50th Anniversary Oral History Project, which we publicly debuted last month on Indigenous Peoples Day. Through this project, we have begun to understand the ways Native students, faculty, and staff have experienced the University of Wisconsin from the early 1970s to today. A core component of the Native community on campus across each of the 5 decades has been American Indian student activism. Indeed, it was American Indian student activism during the late 1960s and early 1970s, which coincided with American Indian activism at the national level that led to the establishment of the American Indian Studies program here at the University of Wisconsin. While the American Indian Studies program remains small, with 5 core faculty members, we are mighty. We do the work of teaching campus-wide ethnic studies requirement courses, spend extra hours outside the classroom cultivating and sustaining relationships with Native students, and engage in research that uplifts Native histories and communities while working to resist harmful erasure narratives and stereotypes. To learn more about the American Indian Studies 50th Anniversary Project, I encourage you to visit our website and to take the time to learn the Indigenous history and presence of the places you call home. Thank you for sharing your morning.
Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Keeler and all the staff members of the American Indian Studies program for their continued excellence over these past 50 years. The Diversity Forum presents an awesome opportunity for attendees to hear from authors, community organizers, activists, researchers, and others working in the areas of diversity, equity, social justice, and inclusion, as well as participate in engaging workshops to further their personal and professional development and find new ways to make a positive impact in the world. As you heard during Dr. Keeler's presentation, and as you will see from other presentations and sessions to come, there's a lot of meaningful knowledge and information, I like to call them nuggets of wisdom, to take in during this forum. I'd also like to make you aware that Meaning Marks will be doing visual note-taking, which will graphically capture key points throughout the forum. They're located in the corner of the room over there, so we're very excited to have their partnership and collaboration in this effort. We know that equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging is a process. It's a journey, if you will. And UW-Madison has committed to embracing this journey. While we have not yet arrived as it relates to a culture wholly characterized by inclusive excellence, we are continually taking steps toward enhancing our climate. As indicated in our campus climate update, we have several initiatives that highlight our efforts. We've talked about the Public History Project, Sifting and Reckoning. It's a great example of embracing a culture of organizational learning as it improves the campus climate by dealing honestly with our past. It provides a fuller picture of our history and gives voice to those who experience and challenge prejudice on our campus and who, through their courage, resilience, and actions, have made UW-Madison a better place. University Relations developed an inclusive communications guide in collaboration with the DDEA and with Student Affairs. The guide is a resource to promote authentic, respectful, and purposeful communications across campus. Student Affairs is our Wisconsin inclusion education program, reached over 10,000 first-year and transfer students, and socializes our students to our values around equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. The McBurney Disability Resource Center has increased capacity to serve 45% more students with disabilities. And similarly, our Employee Disability Resource Office has increased capacity and its services to university employees at a 92% increase since pre-pandemic services. The DDEA has strengthened its leadership team, welcoming 2 new assistant vice provosts to help lead specific diversity efforts on campus, including our scholarship programs and our high-impact educational practices. And as of this fall, each of the 12 largest academic schools and colleges at UW-Madison now employs an administrator in a high-level role dedicated to equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging, a first for the university. These leaders collaborate with myself and others around campus to adapt the campus's vision of belonging to the unique, varying needs of each school and college. Additionally, as it relates to our students, all primary contacts of registered student organizations now have access to an online cultural competency training program developed by the Center for Leadership and Involvement in Student Affairs. The training is based on our Wisconsin inclusion education program required for all new undergraduates that I just spoke about. RSO leaders who take the training will be provided with educational content and scenarios and then given time to reflect on how to best support their peers in similar situations. These initiatives make up only a small fraction of our demonstrated efforts and commitment to EDIB, or equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, across this campus. They truly speak to how we value the contributions each person and respect the profound ways their identity, culture, background, experience, status, abilities, and opinions enrich the university community. Yet, there's still work to do. I'm up for it. Are you? Now I'd like to introduce to you UW-Madison Chancellor Jennifer Mnookin. Chancellor Mnookin is a national expert on law, forensic science, and evidence, and has deep experience as an innovative and talented administrator. Prior to joining UW-Madison, Chancellor Mnookin served as Dean of the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and also held the title of Ralph and Shirley Shapiro Professor of Law. In 2020, Chancellor Mnookin was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and serves on the advisory board of the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Her accolades go on, but I will stop there because if I kept going, she'd be mad at me because that's who she is. But it's my personal privilege to work alongside Chancellor Mnookin as we all endeavor to engage with the latest data and research, to collaborate with attendees of this conference and presenters to learn new perspectives and best practices and be activated to make positive changes not only on this campus, but in our communities and in the world. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor Mnookin to her very first Diversity Forum. A little bit of height difference here.
That's right, just a little bit. Good morning, everybody. Let's do that one more time. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Excellent. And thank you, Dr. Charleston, for that very nice introduction and for also stopping where you did, and for your really terrific work leading the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Educational Achievement and our campus-wide diversity efforts. I'm really delighted to be here with you for my first Diversity Forum. How many of you out here, is it your first Diversity Forum too? Excellent. Well, welcome and congratulations on being here. And I also very much want to welcome those who are with us online. And I hear there are a lot of you. So thank you for being here. Thank you for caring and participating. And for making time at what is undoubtedly a pretty busy time in the semester, because this is very, very important. And so I'm really thrilled to see so many people both in the room and online. I want to give a particular thanks to the conference planners. We know how much work it takes to create an event like this, so let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much for your work to make today possible. And I'm looking forward in just a few minutes to being able to introduce our very exciting keynote as well. I also want to thank all of you for the work you do day in and day out all across our campus to make this a university that works to make all people feel supported, to make all people feel like they can belong here. This is incredibly important work. The embrace of inclusive excellence is an ongoing journey, as Dr. Charleston said, but it's hugely important. And I want to just honor and respect the work that each of you do to make it one step truer and more prevalent tomorrow than it was yesterday. All right, let's give you guys a round of applause for that too. Now, there was a contest last week to pick a student speaker for the December commencement. And the entries, I think, said a lot about how our students experience this campus. And so I'm going to share with you just a little bit about one of them who actually won the contest, Kirsten Gimsey. She's a first-generation college student who dreamed of being a scientist when she was a little girl, but she didn't have a lot of role models for it. As she put it, quote, "I'd never seen a scientist in real life, and as I grew older, that dream seemed akin to dreaming about becoming a basketball star or a famous actress. Not necessarily impossible, but highly unlikely," end quote. She ended up dropping out of high school, but got her GED and then slowly returned to the dream of college. And graduate school brought her here to UW-Madison. She arrived with doubt, self-doubt, probably a little bit of imposter syndrome, which every one of us has felt at some point in time. And she was worried that her differences and her background might make it so that she wasn't accepted here or might not be able to succeed. But something changed her mind, and here's what she said about it. "I've learned many things during my time at UW-Madison. Sure, trivial things like neuroscience and gene therapy, but more importantly, I've learned just how much strength there is in our diversity. I had the privilege of working with and learning from scholars of varied races and ethnicities, genders, disability status, nationalities, religions, sexual orientations, and socioeconomic backgrounds. These experiences helped me view the differences in myself as strengths rather than weaknesses." I think that's profound, and that is part of what we want inclusive excellence to be and to mean. Next month, Kirsten will walk across the stage in the Cole Center to accept her Ph.D. in molecular biology. So she sure achieved that childhood dream. She is a scientist, and that's pretty amazing. But it also says something, I think, profound about how we need to be able to bring our whole selves to our workplaces, to this place, to the work that we do. And it makes me think about a term that I'm sure many of you are well aware of, the term intersectionality. You know it? Yeah? Anyone know who coined it? Kimberly Crenshaw, I hear from a number of people around the stage. Indeed, she did. And do you know that she got her LLM right here at UW-Madison before she came and joined the UCLA Law faculty, where she was one of my colleagues for 17 years. And this is an idea that means, in a sense, that we are multiple, that we have multiple identities, multiple ways of defining ourselves, and that sometimes these can sit on top of each other, and sometimes they can produce even more inequality because of the multiple facets of yourself. But also, it gives us a reminder to think about the different ways that we define who we are, and that we are, every one of us, is intersectional in a variety of ways. And that can be a challenge, but it is also a strength. So the next time you hear someone question why diversity is or should be a top priority, Think about our values and our mission as a public university. And think about students like Kirsten, or one of the thousands of other students whose lives are genuinely transformed by the opportunities that we give them to see the world from multiple intersecting and intersectional perspectives. Now, the theme of today's gathering, the power of remembering, invites us to explore the impact of our past on our present, and to think deliberatively and deliberately about the future we want to create and how we get there. The timing couldn't be better. The university turns 175 next year, and that's a nice moment. You know, I don't know what it is about us, but we like those round numbers and those quarter centuries, right? And so that gives us an opportunity to think, to look ahead at our next quarter century. And I truly believe that vision is a collective enterprise, that it has to be created together. And so I am incredibly excited to be working with everybody to create a vision that will build on existing strengths, but also focus on the places where we might have a chance to do something different and powerful and valuable for the institution. I've been asking two questions just about everywhere I go, and I'm going to ask them here too. And also, you'll get information about how to answer them, including anonymously if you'd like. First, where are we succeeding? What are the things we're doing really well that we want to make sure we don't change? What are the powers and the strengths of this institution as it exists? And second, where are the opportunities for us to embrace change, to do something a little bit differently, whether small, because sometimes small hinges can open big doors, or ambitious and transformative. So far, I'm seeing a good deal of agreement on some of the essential parts of the DNA that we want to preserve and build on, like the Wisconsin idea and the Wisconsin experience. And I'm also seeing a lot of exciting ideas for change, and a number of them are focused directly on improving diversity and creating a stronger sense of belonging here on campus. Just as a couple of examples, I've seen suggestions to improve our graduate student diversity by developing a more systematic approach to draw graduate students from, for example, HBCUs and HSIs. And I've also seen a number of suggestions that suggest that we embrace what has begun and do still more to uplift the voices of people from groups that have been marginalized on our campus by ensuring that we continue to tell those stories about our past in a meaningful way. It's been wonderful to see the great many creative ideas coming in from so many who care about making our university even stronger. And I hope there'll be a QR code you'll all get access to, and I hope that many of you will take the time to share your thoughts about those two questions. We have had recently some milestone events that I do think speak to the power of remembering. While there's no doubt that we have a good deal more work to do, as Dr. Keeler's remarks reminded us, I was proud to be part of the Ho-Chunk flag raising on Bascom Hall earlier this fall. It was a meaningful step toward acknowledging and raising awareness of the history of this land, and one piece of the ongoing work to think about what our shared future looks like with all of the Native nations of Wisconsin. We also, as Dr. Keeler spoke about, celebrated the 50th anniversary of American Indian Studies program, and I got to be at that event, and I got to meet a number of wonderful people, including the iconic Ada Deer, who once said of her own accomplishments, "I just did what I thought was right, and a lot of people came along with me." And that is part of the work of inclusive excellence, trying to do what is right and trying to create community and inspiration around that. And AIS is small but mighty and has done tremendous work to build connection, to create and share new knowledge, and to create a new academic field here at UW. Of course, another example of this kind of work that's been just so impressive this fall is the Sifting and Reckoning exhibit at the Chazen. I want to give enormous props to Kasey Lucchini-Butcher and her talented team. Let's give them a round of applause. I also want to honor and appreciate the hundreds of students, faculty, staff, alums, and community members, a number of whom were here today or are listening online, who shared their often often painful stories, and helped uncover other stories of discrimination and injustice, and also of resistance and building alliances to work for change. I also want to appreciate and give a shout out to my predecessor, Chancellor Rebecca Blank, who funded this project and believed in it, and without whom it would not have come to fruition. So let's give her a round of applause as well. Now, how many of you have already seen the exhibit? Excellent. The rest of you will all be going to the Chazen this evening, right? You absolutely should be. And if you've already been once, go again. I'm told that more than 14,000 people have visited it since it opened 2 months ago, and that's a really terrific and high number. But perhaps even more significant is the number of groups going through as groups. We've had dozens of classes and quite a few campus departments bringing all of their staff. And for many of them, it's their first time visiting the Chazen and an opportunity to see this exhibit and experience it in community. The project's also unique in the country. While other universities have dug into aspects of their history, and there have been some universities that have done pretty deep reckonings with the history of their engagement with slavery in particular, they've focused almost entirely on racial discrimination, which is obviously enormously important. But our project looks at that, but also took a broader view and looks at diversity and prejudice through a variety of lenses and over a longer period of time. Now, I began by talking to you about our student commencement speaker. I want to close by telling you one more story from that contest we had last week. One of the entries was from a young woman who's graduating with a degree from our business school. She was born with a physical disability, and she wrote about building protective walls around herself before she arrived on campus, assuming that she might not find so much kindness or understanding. And she realized that she was wrong about that. She wrote, "I realized that every single person I interacted with had obstacles of their own. I saw people who were struggling financially, physically, mentally, in ways that I wasn't. And I actually found some of the most empathetic and understanding people I've ever met here." We all know that there are many examples we can cite of UW-Madison not quite living up to its ideals or our best selves. But there are also so many examples of really positive change. It's important that we work together to tell both of those kinds of stories, both to name and acknowledge the places where there's significant work to do and where we are not who we'd like to be, but equally the places where we really have made meaningful and important progress on this journey to being an institution that embraces inclusive excellence. Thanks to the deep investments and the hard work happening on every corner of the campus, there are a lot of those successes to cheer. And I hear you'll be hearing more about them in further detail from Provost Schultz tomorrow. Right? Yes? Okay, yes. So I hope that this is a meaningful day. I hope that each of you walks away with something that you feel proud of and something that you feel that you might work on further, and that the same will be true for the institution. And so for now, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for making this important. And now I get a special pleasure, which is I get to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Tiya Miles is an award-winning historian and a professor of history at Harvard University, where she teaches courses on African American women, Native American women, abolitionist women, and Black Indian histories and identities. She's also the author of the 2021 National Book Award winner for nonfiction, called All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, A Black Family Keepsake. Kasey, do you want to hold the book up and wave it for everybody to see? Definitely an amazing read. The book tells the story of several generations of women in one family by tracing the history of a simple cotton bag. And the story reveals a much larger story of the experience of Black women in this country who were enslaved and then given uncertain freedom that left them not at all free. Now, All That She Carried turns out to have become a bestseller, which is amazing and well-deserved. It's been on multiple lists of top 10 books of the year. And you can also read Dr. Miles's essays that illuminate Black history in places like the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and lots of other national publications. She is also a native Midwesterner from Ohio and holds degrees from Harvard, Emory, and the University of Minnesota. And we're just thrilled that she can be with us today. So please join me in a very warm welcome for Dr. Tiya Miles.
All right, that's a shock. Good morning, everyone. I am very happy to be here with you. Wow. So my voice is a little bit off. I've been traveling for some days and I've picked up the bug, which is not COVID. I did test. So please, I ask your forbearance if I need to take a sip of this warm water, which was so kindly provided to me. These are just wonderful event organizers that you all have here. Very thoughtful, very considerate. So the last time I was here at UW was, my goodness, maybe 8 years ago, something like that. I was invited by the history department to give a talk, and I presented on what I felt was going to be a controversial topic for historians. I presented about my research on hauntings in the U.S. South, on haunted plantations, and the ways in which enslaved ghosts were being incorporated into a touristic industry. And I have to say that I was quite nervous. But I spent hours in my hotel room that afternoon before the talk just worrying what the historians here would have to say. And they welcomed my thoughts and gave me wonderful feedback, which contributed to the book that I eventually published based on that research. It strikes me today that back then, ghosts felt like a borderline topic, and now diversity feels like a borderline topic. I mean, diversity used to be, for a little while there, right, for some decades there, a common good that many of us agreed on. And now it has really come under fire as some kind of insidious threat to the education of our children, to the positive functioning of our civic society. And I find that very distressing, the changes that we are seeing across our public culture. It is heartening, though, to see all of you in this room gathered to discuss what I do believe is a common good, and gathered around, in part, an exhibition which really endeavors to show the ways in which our engagement with material culture, with active living communities, could actually help further diversity in a way that doesn't have to wave a banner that people are going to go out and protest. But I think that sometimes we language things in a way in this current moment that gets people's hackles up, and that instead of necessarily coming out and announcing all that we're doing, we could do these activities, we could engage in these projects that actually incorporate an ethic of diversity and incorporate a commitment to bringing people in from across all walks of life, and thereby demonstrate to people that this is a public good, this is a common good. So the talk that I have prepared for our event today is titled Carrying It Forward, Material Culture, Living Memory, and Historical Engagement. And my intention is to talk for just about 30 minutes so that we can have a Q&A and a dialogue. And luckily there's a handy timer going right down there. The epigraph at the top of my talk reads, quote, "The full account must include things as well as words and deeds." And this is a quote from the archaeologist and American Studies scholar John Michael Vlock from his book, The Afro-American Tradition in Decorative Arts. And one of the things that John Michael Vlock did decades ago, which was very interesting and actually created some conflict, was he developed an exhibit on slave quarters. And he had planned that exhibit to be on display at the Library of Congress, and there was actually quite a bit of protest and quite a bit of resistance about that. That came mostly from African American government employees because they were concerned about how a big exhibit about enslaved people's dwellings would actually color them in the light of their colleagues and members of the public. They were worried that they would be stereotyped or seen through the lens of slavery. And I bring this background to this epigraph up to note that diversity is very complex. There are so many potential tensions and conflicts that can arise. We can't always predict them in advance, and we can't always know who might be feeling especially sensitive to a certain topic. I appreciate John Michael Vlock's work for the ways in which he really emphasized the importance of things, for the ways in which he has pointed out that we can't understand a full account of the past just by looking at words and documents. And that ethos is really the engine and the spirit behind my book, All That She Carried. And I came to it not really purposefully, but because of the necessity of that project. So now I'll move into my formal presentation. How do we confront the past and draw lessons from historical relations of power into our present-day awareness? Slavery in the U.S. and the colonies that preceded it is among the ugliest chapters of our history. To engage that period with all the sensitivity that it requires takes delving into our personal and communal wells of imagination and emotion. But the study of slavery has long been a domain of distant documents and written accounts. Historians typically turn to plantation journals, elite family papers and business transactions, diaries of plantation mistresses, newspaper advertisements, and probate records to reconstruct this troubling past. Typical of the available documents, often produced by enslavers or their legal and economic proxies in the service of maintaining an exploitative social system, only reveal the shadowy outlines of enslaved people's actual lives. In an academic field for which the documentary imperative is a disciplining first principle, accessing the experiences of enslaved people themselves, many of whom did not produce documents due to educational and legal prohibitions, has always been a vexed exercise. Nevertheless, those determined to unearth the lives and views of the marginalized have innovated their historical research processes by relying heavily on a number of unusual, or they were viewed as unusual in the past, sources. Those sources have included oral histories, especially those from a set of narratives that were part of the Federal Writers Project, the Works Progress Administration, and also artifacts. And artifacts have traditionally been situated as a specialty of archaeologists. This is one of the reasons why when I started working on my history, All That She Carried, which is actually about a cotton sack that I'll get to in a moment, I was a little hesitant to jump in. I felt that because I wasn't an archaeologist, because I wasn't an art historian, that I didn't have the necessary expertise to really do the project justice. But the history of slavery enslaved people in their past lives actually includes, they have produced a number of materials that still exist and that we can't afford to turn away from, to leave to someone else, if we intend to come closer to their experience, to really see them and respect them, and to bring their history and to bring their ethics, to bring the things they contended with fully in front of our students and members of our communities. So what I'd like to do right now is to explore some examples of what enslaved people, and especially Black women, left behind. And I want to pause here to say that the examples I will share this morning really do focus on Black women who were enslaved and their descendants. But a good deal of my work has also been focused on the enslavement of indigenous people, which is a grave absence in the contemporary awareness of and discussions of slavery. So if this were another talk at another time, and maybe we'll get to it in the Q&A, I could give examples from those experiences of indigenous people who were enslaved. But today I'll be focusing on Black women, and I will want to help us to think about how the things they made and how the things they left behind can lend insight into the question of not only their lives, but also how history can become meaningful to contemporary individuals and families and communities. I will suggest that combining artifacts or material things with documents and oral histories yields rewards for teaching and learning, as well as for making connections among people and between people and the places where they live. As educators and site interpreters, highlighting material objects allows us to connect more directly and viscerally with students and visitors, drawing on what the archaeologist Alexandra Chan and the historic preservationist Thompson Mays have both described as a sensory accessibility peculiar to objects and structures. So a sensory accessibility, which is peculiar to objects and structures. And I want to just pause here to insert that this experience of sensory accessibility can be especially important for a large group of the population that is often not considered when it comes to public interpretation, and those are people with disabilities. That includes me. I'm blind in my left eye, and if you come up to me on this side, I will not see you. I tell my students that all the time. I'm not ignoring you, I just didn't see you when you came here with your question. Many times in public interpretations and exhibitions, people who need to access the information in different ways are not even thought of. But this notion of sensory accessibility, when it comes to what material things can do for us, is really important. And I think it can be especially important for people who do have disabilities. A really wonderful example of this is the Harriet Tubman National Underground Railroad State Park, which is in Maryland. It's in Dorchester County, Maryland, and it's fairly new. And what they have done in that really, really wonderful site is they've taken advantage of the environmental surrounding of the site because it's right next to a national wildlife preserve. And so when you go to the site, you can feel with all of your senses the kind of landscape that Harriet Tubman was forced to work in and that she was able to escape through. And then inside the site itself, there are multiple ways that you can experience the exhibits. You can touch things, you can listen to things, you can maneuver through the various objects and materials in different kinds of ways. So it's a really wonderful example of this. As scholars, writers, teachers, and staff members, physical things push us to think differently, sometimes yielding interpretations that cast new light on how we perceive the lived subjectivity, forced subjection, and crafted resistance of enslaved people. And as members of communities, things can help us feel connected to people of the past and also in the present. And so now I'll move into a few examples of what it is that I've just tried to describe. So what you're looking at right now is the main house of an historic site in Medford, Massachusetts. It's outside of the Boston area, and it is now known as the Royal House and Slave Quarters. Adding slave quarters to the name was actually a very, very long, drawn-out, tension-filled decision on the part of the management and the board of this historic site. For many people, the notion that there could be a plantation in Massachusetts, that there could be a home that was first built by John Winthrop, governor of Massachusetts, that still exists and where enslaved people worked, is shocking. I mean, it's more than shocking. People resist it. People resist the idea that the so-called cradle of liberty was actually a cradle of enslavement for Black people and Indigenous people, and that enslavement is what made things like this gorgeous mansion possible. So this home has gone through interpretive change over the last couple of decades. And one of the people who was at the head of that change, who led it, is a woman named Penny Outlaw. She's an African-American woman who was a member of the board, and she really pushed for the board to change how it is that they would present this site to the public, in part by adding the name slave quarters to the site. I actually have recently been in some conversations with other people at historic sites in Massachusetts who are discovering that they too have slave quarters. But at the time, the Royal House and Slave Quarters was thought to be the only plantation or site in Massachusetts and actually most of that portion of New England to have extant slave quarters. If in the Q&A people want to talk about the name slave quarters and whether or not that's appropriate or what that might spark or trigger in people, I'd be happy to discuss that, because that's another point of contention and discussion. What do we call these things? How do we name them in a way that recognizes what they really were and doesn't sugarcoat it, but that also respects the humanity of enslaved people? So in 2020, right before COVID shut our class down, I was able to take some students to take Penny Outlaw's tour at the Royal House and Slave Quarters, and we got a chance to hear her talk about the ways in which interpretation has changed at the site over time. One of the things she told us is that she sometimes decides to start her tour with a neck iron that she found in an antique shop in New England, which she believes would have been used for enslaved people to control them and to punish them in that area. And she shared with our class how beginning her tour of this site with that object completely changes the ways in which people enter into the space. And she said that she gives people a choice. Some people want to stay far away from that neck iron. I haven't shown you a picture of it purposefully. Some people actually want to hold it and to feel its weight. I have been in the room with it, but I'm not one of the people who wanted to hold it. And she said that when she starts a tour with this iron, people just have a sense of quiet. It's almost as if they're carrying the weight of that thing that they have seen or touched with them as they enter the house. And she said it just totally changes the way they interact with the space and with each other. So inside the home, I forgot to show you this. I actually want you to see this. So this is the slave quarters to the left. And to the right, there's the main house that you just saw, the slave quarters to the left. So let me back up a moment and say that before Penny Outlaw takes people into the home, she has people stand in between these two buildings and to recognize how the physical presence and physical design of those homes themselves can tell us something about the experiences of enslaved people. Because from the royal house, you can see the slave quarters. It is absolutely a design for surveillance. And from the slave quarters, you don't have that same kind of view into the real house. So she points this out about how landscape, architecture, the placement of buildings in spaces can actually reproduce relations of power and actually further the ability for people who have power over others to actually enact that power. Inside the home, she shows people on the tour where enslaved people would have been sleeping, and she has gotten this information from the documentary record, from the papers of the family, and it turns out that there were pallets all over the floors in these various rooms, which really indicates the intimacy that would have existed between enslaved people and their enslavers on northern plantations like this. So my class and I had a really meaningful time at the site. The students wrote papers, they wrote site reviews of their experience and talked about how they felt there, not just what they learned there. It was really interesting because the diverse backgrounds of the students contributes to the ways in which they engage with the site. For example, we've had a student who is actually a descendant of John Winthrop at the site, alongside of students who are descendants of enslaved people, not from that site, but from the US. And that makes for a really powerful set of possibilities to have those students from different backgrounds in the space together, experiencing the home together in a way that has been carefully curated. As a result of the first time that our students went to that site, one of the students in the class who was a graduate student actually applied for the position of executive director of the site, and she is now the only Black woman who is executive director of a plantation in this country. Her name is Kiara Singleton, and that was a really, really wonderful, meaningful outcome of that class. So I want to try to quickly move through a couple of other examples. This is Ashley Sack, the focus of my book, and this is an antique seed or flour sack that was produced in the 1850s, and it was used in South Carolina. The sack was packed with various items by an enslaved woman named Rose, and I see some of you reading right now. It's a very powerful story that Rose's descendant, whose name was Ruth Middleton, later embroidered onto the original item, onto the artifact, onto the sack itself, after she, Ruth Middleton, had moved north to Philadelphia during the Great Migration and started a whole new life for herself in the North. This is what Ruth Middleton stitched onto the sack. My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it be filled with my love always. She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. So when I first saw this object, in real time and in real space, I was actually alone because curators at the Smithsonian African American Museum allowed me to come in before the museum opened to see it and to think about it. And I was just completely taken over by a sense of sadness and loss, by a sense of sorrow and mourning, and also by a sense of exhilaration and joy. Because even though the story on this sack tells us that Rose and Ashley were forced apart for the rest of their lives, like so many enslaved parents and children and family members, the sack also tells us that they were remembered and cherished across the generations and across space, across regions, across time, and that love that Rose, the mother, packed into the sack, and that is so beautifully stitched in the center, prevailed. So I knew I had to write about this. I felt that I had to write a book about this, even though I knew nothing about objects or material culture at that time. I was very much a document and textual and narrative-based scholar. And so I learned because I had to. I learned because it was important. I needed to try to understand the meaning and history of this beautiful, compelling object. That understanding led me down a road, down a path of thinking about material culture and the ways in which the things that we have from the past can open us up. So I think you all felt that. I mean, I'm watching you. You can't really see yourselves as well. I think you all felt that when you saw this object, even on the screen. That there's a sense of a willingness to engage, a desire to learn more that we can achieve through looking at things and considering things that wouldn't be exactly the same if I had shown you, here's my article on Ashley Sack, please go read it. And so I think these kinds of objects can really be important tools. They tell us about Black women, enslaved women in the past. They help us to bring students into that knowledge, and they help us to connect with one another. One of the things that I found out while doing the research on this object is that when it has been on display, there have been curators who have had their tissue boxes ready because people not infrequently burst into tears when they confront this sack. And if you think about it, that exchange of a person with their tissue box and a person who's having an emotional moment receiving a tissue, that's a moment of connection. Actually, it's a moment of intense connection that could be leveraged to spark and to open out other kinds of sustained engagement. This is just the back of the sack where you can see that the family has patched it over time. So my final example, which I won't go into much detail about, is a quilt by Harriet Powers, who was born enslaved in Athens, Georgia. She was one of the best-known African-American women quilters. Her pictorial quilts are the things that really sparked a revival of Black women's quilting. And her two existing quilts were on display for the first time together at the Museum of the Fine Arts in Boston just last year. And these quilts have actually sparked people's imagination and sparked quilters to try to reproduce them and to come together in sewing circles to compare their own works of art. Whenever they do that, they are also engaging Harriet Powers, the artist, and Harriet Powers, the woman who survived enslavement and who created beauty, despite growing up herself in chains. So combined with the documentary record and oral history accounts, objects can enrich our access to enslaved people's lives and times, as well as help us feel more meaningfully connected with each other. Putting our minds to work on physical materials expands the evidentiary base, thereby supporting teaching, public site interpretation, and community conversation. Keeping these objects in view, and when possible, in hand, enables us to envision the past differently or more deeply, affording glimpses of emotion, creativity, spirituality, and resilience. At the same time, taking care to teach with physical materials has the potential to open our students' faculties of feeling and connection, creating moments of vivid learning. Archaeologist James Dietz poetically insisted that, quote, in the seemingly little and insignificant things that accumulate to create a lifetime, the essence of our existence is captured, end quote. While we cannot actually uncover an inner essence of past lives as scholars, we can aim to honor the centrality of the material to enslaved people and their descendants, and recognize the value of things to our interpretation of their worlds and the social navigation of our own time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Kasey Butcher, and I'm the director of UW-Madison's Public History Project. And I'm really, really lucky to get to moderate this Q&A with Dr. Tiya Miles, who's been a personal idol of mine for a really long time. So I'm going to try to keep it very cool, but I'll probably fail at it. So when I was writing up questions, I tried to keep it ones that I thought all of you would be interested in instead of my very, very nerdy public history questions. But as you know, there is a lot of historical reckoning work going on right now at our university, and we're having lots of conversations about our past. And one of the things that struck me about your book, All That She Carried, which if you all haven't read it, you should definitely read it, is that it really seems to be an ode to ordinary people. That you can find that people whose lives are ordinary are made extraordinary by a really deep study of their lives. And that's not really how we learn history in schools. We always learn about the most incredible people, presidents, big movement leaders, the firsts. Can you talk about the power in celebrating the ordinary and giving deep reflection and meaning to everyday life?
Yes, Kasey, I can, and thank you so much for that question, for that very thoughtful question. You know, when I was in high school, I did not enjoy my history class. This is kind of a secret. I didn't enjoy it because it felt to me like it was very kind of, cold and distant, and as Kasey was saying, we learned about these great figures, and I was in high school in the 1980s, you all, kind of a long time ago. So the people we were learning about had nothing to do with me, I felt. And so I didn't associate with that history. It took me a very long time, I think I was a graduate student, before I realized that the stories my grandmother would tell me on the porch about her family growing up in Mississippi and coming up, on the Great Migration, that was actually history too. And once I realized that, then I was all in. Then I felt like, oh my goodness, this is so meaningful. It's so meaningful to think about that my grandmother was a part of history. She was actually a part of one of the most important historical movements in the African American experience. It really is everyday people who make up the vast majority of actions in the past. It's everyday people who make up the spaces and the endeavors that we engage in, for the most part, in our lives. Everyday people matter, but they're also sidelined because they just don't have these troves of special papers that are going to be put in a certain kind of library and cared for, like famous people. So I think that recognizing the beauty and the value in the everyday, in the seemingly kind of mundane aspects of life, is really about getting to the meaning of life itself. It's really important for us. I think it's important for our students to develop that skill of seeing the beauty and the power and the importance in the everyday. And I think that we can also teach how it is that we can uncover those individuals and those histories.
Thank you. I also did not like history in high school. So we made it. We're okay.
We made
We're
it.
doing all right. So speaking of the archive and how we kind of tell history, one of the quotes in your book is from a very famous archival text, which refers to the archives as being inherently incomplete. It calls them rags of reality. But there's also an argument that abandoning the, quote, archivally unknown consigns them to a second death. Can you talk about the importance of expanding our understanding of the past? I think there's a way where sometimes people view history as a zero-sum game, that if we tell new stories, we erase older stories, or if we update our understandings, then old understandings won't be told. Can you talk about how this kind of historical understanding, expanding that historical understanding, helps us all?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I really appreciate the way you put that. I think that's part of the problem that we're seeing right now in public culture and with regard to the fights about so-called critical race theory, in schools. Many people do seem to have this concept of history, which sees history as concrete and static, as a kind of thing. I just talked about things, but in a different way. As a kind of thing that once we've got a hold of it, once we've got it, it's going to remain the same. And it's either real or not real. It's either true or false. This is a deep misconception of what history is, because history is actually, it's more of a process. It's about our endeavor, our quest to uncover evidence of the past and to interpret it to try to determine what it means. And since history is an endeavor and a quest in which we're looking for all kinds of evidence, in which we're going to be bringing our full faculties to bear on that evidence, it's not really a matter of identifying this is the true history and that's the false history. Now, there are some broad outlines that we need to be aware of, right? So people who say the Holocaust didn't happen, clearly that is false. The Holocaust happened. So we can, draw some broad outlines. But when it comes to trying to understand the nuances and the various meanings with regard to certain events, there is room for interpretation. That's what it is that we do. We just have to be sure, if we're working in the field of history, that we are tethering those interpretations to evidence, that we are honestly going out and finding all the sources that we can, and that we're looking at them in conjunction with one another, and that we are attempting to interpret them in good faith. We've got to do all of that. But beyond that, you and I could, and maybe we even would, come across the very same figments and fragments of the historical record in the archive and interpret those differently, because we might have different questions that we brought to the work. We might have different points of focus that we're orienting around. We might have different stakes. We certainly have different backgrounds.
I think one of the interesting things that you do in Ashley Sack is using those fragments or gaps of the archive and just asking questions. And you're very clear that we can't always answer them, and it very much comes from the Saadia Hartman school of thought of asking these kinds of questions. Can you talk a little bit about that power and even just being curious about the past, even if you can't answer the questions, with a firm confirmation?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I do lean into questions a lot. Because, partly, questions are what it's all about. We're all endeavoring to ask questions about our world and to develop knowledge in the university and in intellectual community life. But also asking questions is sort of a way that I can and other scholars who have similar interests can, how should I put this? We can open up space in our work to consider important themes that may not be exactly evident in a direct, kind of on-the-nose way in the documents. So there are things that we as scholars can get a sense of, that we can feel that we know it, but we can't prove it in a way that would be fitting for an historical readership, a scholarly readership. But we can still bring those topics and still bring our interpretation to the fore by using questions. One of the ways I do this in the book is Rose, who is a critically important figure in the history, is somebody who is not easy to pinpoint with 100% certainty in the historical record. And this is the case with many enslaved people who were never famous. This gets back to the question about the ordinary. I mean, Rose and Ashley were just regular Black women. They weren't in the small class of people who might have been able to eke out a way to learn how to read or write. They didn't have any special connections with their enslavers. They didn't have any people who were really kind of looking out for them. They were just ordinary people. And looking at ordinary people, I think, is a way for us to try to get at the things that we kind of know, but that we can't pinpoint. So when it came to Rose, I couldn't find her with 100% certainty in the records, but I found her with what I feel is 97% certainty. And in that section, I ask a lot of questions about Rose herself and about other women like Rose as a way to kind of hold the space that falls in between what we can say that we know with a closer sense of certainty due to the evidence and with what we feel is the case based on a totality of various kinds of sources.
So also in the book, All That She Carried, I will talk about another book, I promise. I have read multiple of your books. There's a more subtle, I think, kind of reflection on these larger institutions, right? Whether that's the house that ended up coming to own Ashley Sack, or whether it's institutions, museums, foundations, nonprofits, that play this role in making history or making history accessible to the public. And often they also play a role in ignoring some histories that they're less comfortable with. And it's also a reflection on how individuals connect with these institutions and learn about the past. Can you talk about this kind of bridge between individuals and institutions and how it affects our understanding of the past and how it obscures or reveals and maybe more importantly, what needs to change in those interactions?
Mm-hmm. Well, individuals can work as gatekeepers. They can kind of stand in the way of people in the public accessing knowledge, whether or not they intend to. They could just have that effect. I've experienced some archivists who, not intentionally, but were gatekeepers to me when I was a graduate student wanted to do research. Some archivists who dissuaded me and told me I wouldn't find anything on my topic. They were actually wrong. Well, they were quite wrong. But they did certainly send me off, into tears to my advisor. But they could have derailed. My quest and my career. Those are individuals. But institutions can have a very strong gatekeeping effect on not only the work of individuals, but also the development of new forms and fields of inquiry. And institutions have a lot of power when it comes to what is deemed to be important or valuable, how it is going to be interpreted and shared with the public or not. And thereby, they have a lot of power in shaping communal and cultural meanings and understandings. One of the things that I talk about toward the end of the book is how Ashley Sack is in South Carolina right now. So when it was at the Smithsonian, it was on loan because it's owned by the Middleton Place Foundation, which is the organizing arm of the Middleton Place Plantation outside of Charleston. That's actually where I was yesterday, you all. I was at Middleton Place last night, or 2 nights ago. And I talk in the book about how I find this uncomfortable. Maybe it's ironic, maybe it's not. Maybe it is exactly what we would expect in terms of the power dynamics. But these women worked really hard to get out of South Carolina, and they didn't go back. But now, this beautiful object that they preserved, that they cared so much about, on which they embroidered their family story, is in the hands not only of a very powerful, very rich institution in South Carolina, which is a plantation, but also, I will add that some of the people who run that foundation are descendants of the enslavers. Now, I want to be careful here because I was talking with the main person behind this foundation just 2 nights ago. And I know that he cares very much about the history. He has now embraced the idea that all sides of history must be told. He even said that Black history is white history and white history is Black history. I will add parenthetically, we need to keep working on the awareness on the part of these stewards of plantations that Native history is part of that story too. But I think that he has come a long way, and I do want to say that. But still, this institution is the possessor of the sack, and what does that mean?
That was one of the more interesting parts of this book to me, was learning about how the sack was found. Can you just say really briefly how it was found?
Mm-hmm. I mentioned in the book that it reminds me of an episode of Antique Roadshow because a woman was flea market shopping in Tennessee, and she found the sack in basically a bin of old rags that were being sold together as a lot, as a group for $20. And she happened to have taken the time, looking for maybe the extraordinary and the ordinary, to take this item out, to handle it, turn it around, and she saw the embroidery, she read it, she saw the name Middleton, she started Googling, she realized, oh my goodness, there are a bunch of really, really rich Middletons in South Carolina, and she ended up donating the sack to the site. That's how they came to possess it. There's more to that story, there's a dream involved, but I don't know if Kasey will give me the time to tell you about the dream.
So in one of your other books that I really enjoyed, The Dawn of Detroit, there's a line in the introduction that always sticks with me, and it's kind of about this point you made about haunting earlier, but about how history haunts. And you say, we sometimes feel the nearness of history, the imprint of people acting and events unfolding in the past. And in that same book, you also delve briefly into the founding history of the University of Michigan, and to an extent, Michigan's failure to fully recognize their history, something that all institutions are guilty of to a certain degree, including this one. Can you speak more to the importance of not only historical knowledge, right, not just researching the past or being honest about the past, but also to the importance of reckoning with it, why it's important to move past just research and documentation into reckoning with it? What do we do with that knowledge once we have it?
Well, when I was doing research on slavery in Detroit, and I thank you very kindly for reading that book, for reading so much of my work, Kasey, I was quite surprised by a number of things that kind of rose to the surface. And one of those was the way in which the enslavement of indigenous women was really critical to the development of Detroit as a fur trading post in the 18th century. Another thing that I found which surprised me is that Americans who had access to enslaved people via marriage with French or British colonists or who had rented enslaved people from French or British colonists, that they and their descendants were some of the early important donors to the University of Michigan. Now, that was a surprise to me. I really wouldn't have thought that a university in the Midwest, a public university in the Midwest, could have ties to slavery, but slavery cast a massive shadow in this country. And it comes up in ways and in places that we might not expect. And this is also my answer to the question, I think, Kasey, and that is, we live our lives in engagement with history all the time, and we aren't necessarily aware of it. But that intertwining of history and the past with our daily lives is actually having an effect on us, and it's having an effect on the ways in which we interact with each other and how we value or devalue people in our community. And so, just for an example, when students are walking around a campus and they're passing by, a statue or some kind of feature of the built environment that venerates a historical figure who was an enslaver or who was somebody who involved themselves in massacres of indigenous people, those students are actually taking that in, and it's affecting them whether or not they know it. They might be rushing to class, but they're getting the subtle message of, this is what's important here. This is who's important here. This is who is not seen here. This is who is invisible here. This is who is not important here. And I think that they really take that with them into the class, no matter what the class is. They go in, they're going to take the molecular, whatever it is, exam that we heard from the Chancellor, the student who graduated. Yes, hooray, hooray for that Ph.D. student. And that sense of what the campus environment is telling them is still with them. And I think this happens in families. I think it happens in community spaces, that we carry that history with us, and it affects how we interact. So it seems to me that it's much better to just go ahead and get it out on the surface. Go ahead and get it out there so we can all see it and examine it together, so that we can all openly consider the ways in which we want it to affect our lives and to affect our interactions.
As the director of the Public History Project, yes. An affirmative yes. So as the director of the Public History Project here, public history is something that I get asked about all the time. What is public history? What does it look like? And I often tell people, trust me, you've engaged with it, whether you knew it was public history or not. And one of the things that always stuck out to me about you as a working historian is that you work at Harvard, you're a historian, capital H historian, but you often call yourself a public historian, and you're very adamant about making sure that the work that you do is accessible to the public, that it does not just stay within the bounds of the university or within the bounds of the historical profession. And we have a very important idea here called the Wisconsin idea, which is, essentially argues that the work that happens on campus should benefit everybody in the state, but also out past the state of Wisconsin, right? It should benefit the globe. Can you talk a little bit about why you think it's so important to really leave those bounds of the university behind to make sure that your work, and particularly with history, is benefiting a larger audience than the historical profession?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've already confessed, and so has Kasey, that I wasn't a fan of history in high school. I am also not a person who ever thought that I would be an academic. I didn't really know that being an academic was a job. The way I found out was in college. One of my roommates had two parents who were professors. I thought, oh, wow, professors is a job, and look at that. And so I feel like I was just a person who enjoyed reading and writing and thinking and talking with people about ideas, and the space of a campus seemed to be a natural fit for those kinds of interests. I never thought, oh, I want to be, an academic. And so doing work that was publicly engaged and publicly relevant was just my natural approach to scholarship. And it wasn't until I was, I don't know, probably about to publish my first book that I realized that it was public history. I didn't know it was public history. I just thought it was history that I want to be meaningful to communities. And I knew that while doing the research, oh, by the way, I should fill you in. This first book was about slavery in the Cherokee Nation. It was about a mixed-race Afro-Cherokee family and the ways in which that family navigated some really difficult terrain around racialization and enslavement and removal and indigenous citizenship. So in that book, I was working on it during a time when the Cherokee Nation was itself involved in a lot of conflict around whether or not it would accept the descendants of freed people as citizens. And I wanted the book to contribute to that conversation in a positive way. Now, some people might feel that histories shouldn't have some kind of intentionality like that the scholar should just go in and they should just want to find out what happened in the past and just present it, and that it would all be kind of objective and clear and clean in some way. That's never the way I've thought about my work. I wanted that first book to be a contribution to a very difficult conversation. And that meant that I had to talk with people. I had to go to Oklahoma. I had to try to understand the different points of view. I had to try to think very carefully about how I wrote it so that I could present these details and this evidence about just the very fact of Cherokee enslavement of Black people in a way that Cherokee people might be able to receive it. And all of that was public history, and I just didn't know it.
Okay, so I could ask you 100 more questions, but I also want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. So now is the time. If you have a question for Dr. Miles, you have the opportunity to ask her. I think we have microphone runners around the room.
There's a hand over there.
It's on. Okay. Thank you. Good morning. I'm nervous. Thank you for your words today. I'm going to buy your book, but just thinking about ordinary Black women who made me, I'm just really moved by it. So thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay. So my question, when you were talking about statues on campuses and how students take from that as they are walking and learning and growing, I'm curious to know a little bit about how you respond to or your thoughts around buildings and statues that honor enslavers, colonizers, and how we should respond. My response is, let's rename all the buildings and be done. Perhaps name them in honor of those extraordinary, ordinary people. But I'm curious to know how you might respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I appreciate the question, and also your willingness to be vulnerable and to share your response to some of the things that I've shared with you today. I think this is a difficult issue. I will say that I felt conflicted by the kind of spontaneous public dismantling of many of the statues across the city, especially in, I think it was summer 2020 that we saw the height of that. Bless you. I felt conflicted because a part of me, whenever a statue of Christopher Columbus comes down, a part of me just sings, okay? I have to say that. But also, I don't condone the use of, a physical, assault or attack on public objects. I don't think that's the best way to go about it. I think that is destructive of not only the physical objects themselves, but also of the possibilities for public conversation that could develop. And bless you again. So I think, and I really, you can probably hear as I'm trying to answer that I wrestle with this. I really wrestle with it. But I think that the most constructive approach would be for the community, for people who have ownership over those public spaces and those memorials and those statues, to come together in some kind of organized way and talk about it so that the different voices can be heard and so that people can decide together what it is they want to do. Now, the problem is maybe half people are going to want to take it down and half people are going to want to keep it up, and it's not going to be an easy solution. But then if that statue does come down, it will have been through a process of deliberation and discussion, as opposed to through an act that is, I keep trying to find a word. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word violence as I describe this. I'm trying to avoid the use of the word desecration too. But as opposed to an act that is sort of a spontaneous, dismantling or destruction of an object. I want to share too, in response to your question, that after my book on Detroit came out, and still today, I have heard from people who are descendants of slaveholders in Detroit, and they were surprised to learn this. I had people write me and say, well, your book says that my great-great-great, owned slaves, and what evidence do you have? And so I always send them the evidence. I feel like that's part of my work as a public historian, right? To provide the documents might take a while, but I'm going to do it. And for the most part, people do respond again, and they kind of say, oh. And now what do I do with how I think about my life? That's another example of people using history, not even necessarily consciously, as a way to construct their identities and to engage in everyday life. But there was one descendant of an enslaver in Detroit whose forefather was really famous and had a big statue, and he ended up writing an op-ed in a Detroit paper saying he wanted the statue taken down. Now, most of the people who were engaging with this publicly didn't agree with him. But I thought it was really important that he took, first of all, that he acknowledged this history in his family, and that he was willing to face up to a sense of responsibility. I didn't answer your question about that, Kasey, did I? What do we do? He was willing to be responsible in the public sphere and to kind of put his name to a response which said, hey, well, he didn't say this exactly, I'm saying this, but I feel like he was saying, hey, this statue and commemoration affects me and my family the most. We're the descendants. And I'm saying, no, thank you. We don't need to have this guy in the public square. So I think it is possible. Yes, I think it is possible that people can change their views, but sometimes it takes time. And it takes sometimes doing the work of showing them as close as we can come to the reality of what took place in the past.
Hi. Dr. Miles, thank you so much for your insights and your time. I was struck with your speaking about how in doing this work and uncovering the full story of history and doing, earnest interpretations of history, we often come into conflict with people who view history as something that's static and fixed and not something to be messed about with. And certainly I'm sure that there are people who will hold that sincere belief, right? But I think also so often those arguments are made in bad faith because those people see parts of history that they would rather not have talked about because they benefit from it in their wealth and their power and their position, et cetera. How can we in this work not be sucked into like these semantic bad faith arguments to present our work in a way that's genuine, but also not, have our work and the work that we're doing to share an honest interpretation of history derailed by bad faith?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. There are a lot of bad faith arguments out there. Yes. And there's a lot of meanness out there, too. There's a lot of meanness out there in social media and in private email inboxes. Yeah. I think that a way to approach bad faith arguments and a way to approach people who just want to be completely recalcitrant and in very ugly ways about this is to team up with other people. And so, for example, I wrote an op-ed some years ago about Detroit. And there were some people who wrote some comments, and they were speaking from the position of a white identity. Let me be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with, of course, whiteness. Of course, I do not. But these people were speaking from a white identity position and saying that, and they were saying some really, really ugly things about my argument, about the history of Detroit, and the multiraciality of it. And a colleague of mine, a Native American historian, who's actually from the Radcliffe area, his family's from Wisconsin, when he told me, stop reading the comments. He said, don't read the comments. I will read them for you, and I will tell you if there's anything in there that you need to be aware of or to respond to. And that was just such an amazing thing that he did for me, because it protected me from like a lot of ugliness that was actually, just chipping away at my spirit. But it also reassured me that I would be informed by somebody who cares about me and cares about this research if anything was happening that I really should know about. So what he did was he multiplied my ability to manage it by stepping up. I will always be grateful to him for that. His name was Michael Whitkin, by the way, Michael Whitkin. And I think that we can consciously build collaborations and teams like that. So maybe there are some people on the team who they need to be back in the workspace, really creatively imagining how are they going to plan this program, how are they going to write this report, how are they going to plan this exhibit. And they really don't have the bandwidth to deal with people who are coming at them with these straw person arguments or just trying to create chaos. But maybe there are some people on the team who actually love to get out there. My sister's one of these people. I mean, my sister is like, she will argue you in a minute. I mean, there are other people on the team who would love to get out there, and they feel comfortable, being the spokesperson for the team, and they feel comfortable, reading the comments. The work can be divided in that way, so that everybody can play a role in creating the most effective public engagements.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation and your contributions. And I'm very struck by the comments that you make about the landscape and the contributions of that to our interpretation of history. And in terms of our setting here, as being many of us either housed in administrative buildings, but also in academic buildings where our landscape is our hallways. And in my department, horticulture, we're starting conversations about how do we make hallways inclusive, like how to, and welcoming, and how do we sort of present our past in terms of ways that we're still also welcoming to people who we want to have come be with us. And so I was wondering if you could comment at all on sort of on that endeavor of sort of like the inside environment of an academic institution in terms of creating inclusion from a historical standpoint. Does that help?
I have never been asked that question before. I love that question. The idea of hallways as landscape is what I'm going to be thinking about on the plane. Very, very, very interesting. I think I want to go a roundabout way to trying to answer that question by saying that when students come into my office, they most often just kind of sit for a minute and they look around and they say something like, I love your office. Like it's so cozy in here. I love being in here. And in thinking about your question, I'm also thinking about what is leading them to feel that way. And when I think about the elements of my office, I realize that I do have a number of natural kind of objects in my office. I have plants and I have baskets. I have baskets that were actually woven in South Carolina. And I think that having things that come from the earth is actually soothing to people. I have in my office a number of textiles to try to soften the walls. I also have what are those things called? Those little bobblehead dolls from the Black Panther movie in my office. I have children's books in my office, which are faced out, and the children's books are from a range of backgrounds, and so when students come in, they're going to see these beautiful, images on the front cover of these books. I have gifts from students in my office, so if they gave me a card last year, they'll come in and they'll see it this year. And I think that those kinds of physical touches to an environment which help to connect us to the outside, which help to personalize and to make kind of more welcoming a space, does make a difference for how people feel in the space. Now, hallways are tricky, I think, because they tend to not have windows, but I think if a hallway does have a window, making the most of a window would be important. With your question, I'm now trying to imagine how a hallway could be made to feel more peaceful, like what kinds of colors should hallways be painted. I remember reading somewhere that green is the most pleasing color to the seeing human eye because it's connected to a color that we most often see in the natural world. So I'm thinking of green hallways, especially for your department. That could work.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming, for giving a speech, for answering questions. Dr. Miles, everybody.
Thanks, thank you.
I think I probably could speak for everyone in here when I say, wow. Such a powerful and compelling account of how the things that folks made and left behind gives us insight to how ordinary histories can become informative, are meaningful, and draws connections between people and places wherein they live. That sensory accessibility is really important. That struck me. That was really powerful to me. Understanding that physical things push us to look at things differently, connecting us to people in the past and in the present. It affirms the theme of this forum, that things from the past can open us up. They can become important tools that help us to connect not just with things and histories, but to one another. Gives us these moments of intense connection. Dr. Miles began talking a little bit about how diversity feels like a borderline topic. I am proud to be a part of an institution with colleagues and friends all over this room where we are here to discuss and engage in the common good that is diversity, recognizing the power, the impact, and the innovation that comes from diversity. So give ourselves a round of applause, because we are here, and it's work that's important to us. And as I look around the room, one, I realize I'm either getting old, because I know a lot of people in here, and the people that I know, we've been at this for quite some time, and we're committed to this work, so we will continue doing the work. How awesome was it that the first 100 people, who was among the first 100 people to get a book? I was too, so for those who wasn't, sorry for you. You got to order your book somewhere. I don't know what to tell you. But the All She Carried, if you were one of those 100 folks, individuals, and you would like to have your copy signed, please go to the Marquee Lounge, which is right. If you go out of this door and you go right down and to your left, there will be a book signing, and Professor Miles will be there to sign your book. Otherwise, I invite everyone to take this time to take a break, to network with other attendees and reflect on the messages that we have heard before we commence with lunch at 11 a.m. So thank you all. Let's take a short break, commence with lunch at 11 a.m.